You did not choose to feel what you're feeling right now. Not entirely, not in the way that the culture of self-improvement suggests, the way that implies that with enough awareness and enough work and the right techniques applied consistently, you could be the author of your own emotional life, could feel what you decide to feel, could respond to circumstances with the measured, chosen, freely selected responses of a person who is genuinely in charge of their own interior. This is not how it works. The anger arrives before you have decided to be angry. The anxiety is present when you wake up, already there, not waiting for your permission. The love, the specific, ungovernable, entirely involuntary love that reorganizes everything, this did not ask you first. The grief that surfaces without warning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, the specific, unreasonable fear that attaches to things that are not dangerous. The desire that moves you toward things you know are not good for you with the specific, humiliating efficiency of a force that does not consult your judgment before acting. You are moved by things you do not understand. This is not a failure of character. It is not evidence that you have not done enough work on yourself. It is not a problem that the right therapy or the right practice or the right philosophical framework will finally solve in the sense of making it stop. It is the human condition as Baruch Spinoza understood it, with a precision that no one before or since has matched. Amsterdam in the 17th century was the most tolerant city in Europe, which is not saying as much as it sounds. Tolerance in 17th century Amsterdam meant that you could practice your religion without being burned for it most of the time, within certain limits, subject to negotiation depending on the political weather. It meant that the Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492 and 1497 could build a community on the canals of the Dutch Republic and practice their faith and participate in the trading economy that was making the Netherlands the wealthiest place in the world. The Dutch were tolerant because tolerance was profitable, because the Sephardic merchants who arrived from the Iberian Peninsula brought with them the commercial networks, the languages, the specific knowledge of Mediterranean and Atlantic trade routes that made them valuable to a republic whose entire existence depended on commerce. They were tolerated the way a useful tool is tolerated, within limits, with the understanding that the tolerance was conditional, that the community's survival depended on not making itself inconvenient to the people whose goodwill made the survival possible. The Amsterdam Jewish community in the 1630s and 1640s was not a simple or unified thing. It contained within it the full range of responses to the specific, impossible situation of a people who had survived forced conversion and the Inquisition and expulsion, and who were now trying to rebuild a Jewish life in the fragments of what had been destroyed. They had been conversos, new Christians. For generations, some of them for a century and a half, they had practiced their faith in secret while performing Catholicism in public. They had learned to maintain two faces simultaneously, the Catholic face for the world, the Jewish face for the house, for the Passover Seder conducted in secret, for the prayers said in Hebrew in rooms with the shutters drawn. They had become, through the specific necessity of survival, experts in the gap between what is performed and what is real. And now they were in Amsterdam, and the performance was no longer necessary, and they were supposed to simply be Jewish again, were supposed to return to a tradition many of them had never fully known, that their parents and grandparents had maintained only in fragments, that had been transmitted in whispers and in the stubborn persistence of half-remembered rituals, rather than in the full, uninterrupted transmission of a living community. They were rebuilding from fragments, under conditions of conditional tolerance, in a city that would withdraw its protection if the community became an embarrassment, with the specific vigilance of a people who understood, in the bone, that belonging was always precarious, that the gap between acceptance and expulsion could close with terrifying speed, that the community's survival required the management of appearances, required the performance of coherence, required, above all, the suppression of the questions that could crack the performance open. Baruch Spinoza was born into this community on the 24th of November, 1632. His father Michael was a merchant, reasonably prosperous, respected in the community, a warden of the synagogue, a man who had made the accommodation with Dutch commercial life that the community's survival required. His mother Hannah died when Baruch was 6 years old. His stepmother Esther died when he was 17. His father Michael died in 1654, leaving Baruch and his brother Gabriel to manage the family business and its accumulating debts. He grew up, in other words, in the specific atmosphere of loss and precariousness and conditional belonging that characterized the Sephardic community in the decade of his childhood. He grew up speaking Portuguese at home and Spanish in the community, and Dutch in the streets, and Hebrew in the synagogue, and Latin in the school where he studied the tradition with the scholars. The community had engaged to transmit what had been interrupted. He was a good student, exceptionally good. He had the specific quality of attention that marks certain minds from very early. The quality of genuine curiosity, of wanting to understand rather than merely to know, of pressing past the given answer to the question the given answer raises. He studied Talmud and Torah with the rabbis. He studied mathematics and natural philosophy through the connections his commercial life provided. He read everything he could find in the community's libraries and in the libraries of the collegians, the liberal Christian sect whose intellectual openness made them natural allies of the questioning minds within the Jewish community. And he found in the reading that certain questions would not stop, not rebellious questions, not the questions of a young man who wants to reject what he has been given, because rejection feels like freedom. The harder questions, the ones that arise from taking the tradition seriously enough to follow its implications wherever they lead. Questions about the nature of God, about whether the God of the Bible, the God who gets angry, who regrets, who changes his mind, who has preferences about what human beings eat and how they dress and who they sleep with, whether this God was consistent with the God of reason, with the God of infinite perfection and necessary existence that the philosophical tradition was describing. Whether these were the same God, or whether the attempt to make them the same God required a kind of intellectual dishonesty that he found increasingly impossible to maintain. These questions had been in the air in the Amsterdam community before Baruch was born. Uriel da Costa, a generation before him, had asked versions of them and had been excommunicated and readmitted and excommunicated again, and had finally, in 1640, shot himself in Amsterdam after being forced to perform a public humiliation for his views. The community knew where these questions led. The community had every reason to discourage them. Baruch kept asking them anyway, not publicly, not yet. In the conversations with the small circle of friends and correspondents who shared his intellectual interests, the former student of the rabbis, the lens grinder, the man who had learned enough of the tradition to know where it strained against what he actually believed and who could not, with whatever good intentions, pretend the strain was not there. He was, in the years before the excommunication, precisely the kind of person that every community organized around shared belief finds most threatening, not the person who rejects the tradition contemptuously, who dismisses it without having understood it, who has not paid the price of genuine engagement with what they are leaving behind. The person who has engaged with it fully, who knows it thoroughly, who takes it seriously enough to follow its implications to places the community cannot afford to go, who is not fleeing the tradition but following it further than the tradition's custodians can permit. He was 23 years old in the summer of 1656. The family business was struggling. He had recently appealed to the Amsterdam court for a brief legal exemption from debt, formally identifying himself as a member of the Jewish community for legal purposes. He was, by every outward measure, still a member of the community that had formed him. And then on the 27th of July, 1656, they cast him out. The cherem, the document of excommunication, was issued by the wardens of the Amsterdam congregation. It is the harshest excommunication ever recorded from that community, and one of the most severe in the history of Jewish law. The language is extraordinary, not in its precision, but in its violence. Extraordinary because it does not specify what Baruch has done. It refers in terms of maximum condemnation and minimum information to abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. It uses every formulation of exclusion available in the tradition. It forbids any member of the community from communicating with him, from being within 4 cubits of him, from reading anything he has written, from doing him any service, from sharing a roof with him. Then it says nothing more. 350 years of scholarship have produced no consensus on what specifically he had done, No document survives that records the offense. The most likely answer is that he had been saying, in private conversations with the small circle of friends who shared his questioning, the things he would later write, that the God of Scripture is not the God of nature, that Moses was a political legislator rather than a divine prophet, that the soul is not immortal in the personal sense, that miracles are impossible, that the laws of the Torah were appropriate to the ancient Israelite state and not eternal commands binding on all Jews for all time. These were not abstract philosophical positions to the community that cast him out. They were an attack on everything the community's survival depended on. A community whose conditional tolerance rested on its ability to demonstrate its conformity, whose relationship with the Dutch authorities depended on appearing unified, orderly, theologically coherent, whose internal cohesion depended on the maintenance of the tradition that had survived the Inquisition and the expulsion and the forced conversion. A community that had, in the very marrow of its institutional memory, the knowledge of what happens to Jewish communities when they make themselves inconvenient to the people whose tolerance is the condition of their existence. They were afraid, they acted from fear, from the passive emotion of a community whose survival had depended for generations on the management of risk. From the inadequate idea that the danger was the questioner rather than the condition that made the questioning dangerous. From the specific, human, entirely understandable bondage of people who could not afford the luxury of following their most honest thinkers wherever the thinking led. Baruch understood this. Not immediately, not without cost. The excommunication was not painless. He was 23 years old. He had grown up inside this community. It had given him his language and his learning and his sense of who he was in the world. To be cast out of it, with the most extreme language the tradition possessed, for the crime of thinking too honestly, was not nothing. But he did not respond with bitterness. He did not respond with rage or with the resentment of the person who has been wronged and cannot stop inhabiting the wrong. He responded with the only response that his nature made available. He kept thinking. He kept following the questions wherever they led. He took the rooms that the collegians provided, and he set up the lens-grinding tools that would pay for the thinking, and he began the work that would take the next 20 years of his life and produce the most ambitious philosophical system since Aristotle, and kill him with the glass dust it required. The community had acted from bondage, had been moved by forces it did not understand, by the fear that was the passive emotion of a people whose history gave them every reason for it. And the man they cast out would spend the next 20 years writing the most precise account ever produced of exactly why people do what they did, of how the passive emotions operate, of what it would mean to understand them rather than simply be moved by them. This is not irony. It is the argument made biographical, the philosophy demonstrated before it has been written, the world showing, in the specific drama of one community's act of exclusion, exactly the bondage that the ethics would spend 500 dense geometric pages mapping. He set up the lenses, he began to grind. The rooms he lived in for the next 20 years were small. This is not a metaphor. They were physically small, rented rooms in the houses of the collegians and sympathizers who provided shelter to the excommunicated philosopher, first in Ringeburg, then in Voorburg, then finally in The Hague, where he would spend the last decade of his life. Small rooms with a desk and the lens-grinding tools and the books and the correspondence. He ground lenses. He did this every day, with the patient, skilled attention of someone who had learned the craft properly and who understood that the work had to be good, that the quality of the lenses mattered, that people's ability to see depended on the precision with which the glass was shaped. He ground telescope lenses, microscope lenses, the instruments that were, in the 17th century, the new technology of seeing, the tools that were extending the range of human perception beyond what the naked eye could reach, into the distant stars and into the microscopic structures of living things, into the territories that were remaking what it meant to know. He was, in the literal physical sense, in the business of making things visible that had been invisible, grinding the glass that allowed the eye to reach what the eye could not naturally reach, doing this with his hands, in the small rooms, with the fine glass dust settling into his lungs, with the quiet, unannounced efficiency of a cause that does not need your awareness to produce its effect. The glass dust was killing him. He knew this. Everyone who ground lenses knew this. The fine particles settled in the lungs and accumulated there, and the accumulation was slow, and then it was not slow, and then it was finished. He knew the mechanism. He understood the cause. He kept grinding because the grinding paid for the thinking, and the thinking was what he was. This is the biography of the philosophy made flesh. A man who spent his life arguing that freedom consists in understanding what is moving you, not in escaping it. Who argued that the causes are what they are, that necessity runs all the way down, that the fantasy of the uncaused will is not freedom, but ignorance dressed up as freedom. Who argued that the only genuine freedom available to a human being is the freedom that understanding provides, not the freedom from causes, but the freedom of knowing them. And who demonstrated this in the most literal way available by continuing to grind the glass that was destroying his lungs in full knowledge of what the grinding was doing. Not because he was indifferent to his own survival, because the alternative, abandoning the work, abandoning the thinking, accepting the professorships and the patronage that would have required him to confine his philosophizing within the limits of the publicly established religion, would have been a different kind of destruction, would have been the destruction of the only thing that made the survival worth having. He understood what was moving him, he kept moving. The freedom that understanding gives, which is the only freedom Spinoza believed that is actually available to a human being, and which is, as his life demonstrates in the most direct and most uncomfortable way possible, more than enough, if you have the courage to pursue it. There is a question that runs through the Amsterdam Jewish community of the 1640s like a crack in a wall, not visible from a distance, present when you press close, running from the foundation upward through the plaster of the official surface, branching, widening, impossible to ignore once you have learned to see it. The question is this: how much of what we believe do we actually believe? Not as an accusation, not as the cynical observation of someone who has decided that all religious practice is performance and all communal identity is theatre, as the genuine, uncomfortable, entirely serious question of people who have been through what this community has been through and who are trying, in good faith, to understand what survived the passage. They had been conversos, new Christians, for generations, some families for 4 generations, some for 5, some for as long as any living member could remember. They had practiced Catholicism in public and Judaism in secret, had been baptized and had sent their children to Mass, and had confessed to priests and had performed, with whatever degree of conviction the circumstances required, the rituals of the faith that the Inquisition demanded. And in the back rooms, in the whispered Hebrew of half-remembered prayers, in the Passover Seder conducted with the shutters drawn and the servants sent away, and the lookout posted at the door, they had maintained something, a thread, a connection to what they had been before the expulsion, before the forced conversion, before the century and a half of living as one thing in public and another thing in private. They had survived by becoming experts in the gap between what is performed and what is real, between the face shown to the world and the face shown in the private room, between belief as social requirement and belief as actual conviction. They had navigated this gap with extraordinary skill for generations. They had kept the thread alive. They had transmitted it in fragments and in whispers across the century and a half of the forced performance. And now they were in Amsterdam, and the performance was no longer required, and they were supposed to simply be Jewish again, openly, publicly, without the gap. But the gap does not close, because the external requirement for it is removed. The gap had been inside them for too long, had become a structural feature of the interior, a way of inhabiting belief that had been installed by the specific, traumatic, centuries-long experience of performing one thing and being another. The habit of holding the official position and the private position simultaneously, of knowing that the official position was a performance and maintaining it anyway, because the performance was the condition of survival. This habit did not disappear because Amsterdam was tolerant. It had become, for many of them, the only way they knew how to hold a belief at all. This is the world into which Baruch was born. Not a simple world of faith and practice and communal belonging, a complicated world, a world that was trying, with genuine effort and genuine love for the tradition, to rebuild something from fragments, a world that was doing this under conditions that required still a degree of performance. That required the appearance of coherence and unity for the Dutch authorities whose tolerance was conditional. That required the suppression of the questions that could crack the performance open. A world in which the gap between what is performed and what is real, was the foundational condition, not a failure, the inheritance. The specific psychological legacy of a century and a half of converso existence passed down through the generations with the same faithfulness with which the half-remembered prayers had been passed down. The expertise in doubling that had been the community's survival skill, and that was now, in the specific freedom of Amsterdam, becoming its most pressing internal problem. Baruch grew up in this gap. He was, from childhood, a student of it. The education he received was the best the community could provide, which in the Amsterdam of the 1640s was genuinely excellent. The community had engaged serious scholars to transmit the tradition. Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, who had studied in Venice and was one of the most learned men in the community, taught Talmud with the rigorous precision of someone who understood that the tradition had to be reconstructed properly or the reconstruction would be false. Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, a more publicly visible figure whose connections extended across European intellectual life, whose books were read by Christian scholars from England to Poland, who was in negotiation with Oliver Cromwell about the readmission of Jews to England. This was the world Baruch was studying in. It was not an intellectually simple world. It was a world in which the tradition was being examined and debated and reconstructed by some of the most learned Jews in Europe, in which the questions were serious, and the engagement was genuine, and the scholarship was real. Baruch absorbed all of it. He was the student that teachers remember, the one who has already thought further than the lesson when the lesson arrives, who asks the question that the lesson was not designed to produce, who is not being difficult, who is being so genuinely attentive to the material that the material's implications become unavoidable. He was also, from early in his studies, encountering the parallel tradition, the philosophical tradition, the Greek and Arabic and medieval Jewish philosophy that ran alongside the scriptural tradition, and that was in some tension with it in ways that the community's official position required managing. Maimonides had spent his life managing this tension. The great medieval philosopher had argued, with extraordinary ingenuity and extraordinary learning, that the God of Scripture and the God of reason were the same God, that the apparent contradictions between biblical narrative and philosophical truth were the result of misreading the Scripture, that the Scripture spoke in parables and accommodations to the limited understanding of the masses, that properly interpreted by the philosopher who understood both the philosophical truth and the scriptural text, the contradiction dissolved. Baruch read Maimonides carefully. He found the argument ingenious. He could not make himself believe it, not because he lacked the intelligence to follow it, because he had the specific quality of honesty that makes certain arguments impossible to accept, even when you can see their elegance. The quality that says, I understand the argument, and I can see that it is constructed with great skill, and I cannot accept it, because the construction is in service of a conclusion that the evidence does not support, because the God of Maimonides' rationalization is not the God of the Bible, and the pretense that they are the same God requires, at a certain point, not interpretation but invention. He continued to study. He moved in his reading beyond the Jewish philosophical tradition into the new philosophy, into Descartes, whose discourse on the method and meditations were transforming European intellectual life, whose attempt to rebuild knowledge from certain foundations was producing the most exciting philosophical work of the century, into the natural philosophers, into Galileo and the new science of motion, into the new astronomy, into the systematic investigation of the natural world that was producing a picture of reality increasingly at odds with the picture the scriptural tradition had assumed. He found that the new philosophy and the new science and the honest reading of the biblical text and the philosophical tradition were all pointing in the same direction toward a picture of God and nature and human beings that was different, in fundamental ways, from the picture the tradition required him to accept. He could not unsee this. He was not the kind of person who could unsee things. He was also in these years not alone in the questioning. There was a small circle. Francis van den Enden, a former Jesuit who was teaching Latin and philosophy in Amsterdam, and whose household was a gathering point for the intellectually adventurous, the politically radical, the people who were following the new philosophy wherever it led, regardless of where it went. Juan de Prado, a former converso physician, who had made the same journey from the Iberian Peninsula that Baruch's family had made, who had the same questions, who was already in trouble with the community for views that sat uneasily with the tradition's requirements. Simon de Vries, Peter Balling, others whose names appear in the early correspondence, people who were thinking seriously and who found in Baruch's company the specific pleasure of thinking in the presence of someone who is thinking better than you and pulling the thinking further than you could pull it alone. These conversations were, for Baruch, the closest thing to intellectual freedom available to him in the Amsterdam of the 1640s and early 1650s. The space in which the questions could be asked at full volume without the management that communal life required. The space in which the gap between the official position and the actual thinking could be acknowledged and examined rather than navigated. He was 20, he was 21, he was 22. He was becoming the thinker he was going to be, with the specific urgency of someone who has a great deal to say and has not yet found the form that will say it properly, writing early versions of arguments that would take 20 years to reach their final form, working through the implications of ideas that were still unfolding, building, in the conversations and the notebooks and the reading, the architecture of a philosophical system whose foundations he could already see clearly, even if the superstructure was still being constructed. And he was, with increasing inevitability, becoming impossible for the community to accommodate, not because he wanted to be, not because he was seeking the confrontation, because the honesty he was constitutionally incapable of abandoning was pointing toward conclusions that the community was constitutionally incapable of accepting, because the questions he could not stop asking were leading to answers that the community could not afford to hear, because the gap between what he actually believed and what the community required him to believe was widening past the point where it could be managed. There were rumors. There were conversations that were reported back to the community leadership. There were possibly early writings that circulated in the small circle and found their way to the wrong eyes. There was the specific accumulating tension of a community that knows something is wrong and does not yet know what to do about it. They tried first to negotiate, according to one account, and the accounts of this period are fragmentary, the evidence partial, the full story unavailable to us 350 years later. There was an offer, a payment, 1,000 florins a year, which was a substantial sum, in exchange for his agreement to maintain the outward forms of Jewish practice and to refrain from publicly contradicting the tradition, to manage the gap, to perform the required coherence, to be in public what the community needed him to be while remaining in private whatever he actually was. He refused. He could not do it. Not because he did not need the money, he needed it. Not because he was indifferent to the community that had formed him. He was not indifferent, because the performance of belief he did not hold was the one thing his nature could not accommodate. Because the gap between what is performed and what is real, the gap that the community had been living in for generations, the gap that the converso experience had installed in the communal interior as a survival skill, this gap was, for him, the disease, not the solution. He had been watching the gap his whole life, in the community that was rebuilding itself from fragments of a tradition, half remembered through the forced performance of another, in the scholars who argued for the compatibility of the God of the Bible and the God of reason with a rigour that could not quite conceal the strain the argument was under, in himself, in the years of managing the questions in private while maintaining the outward forms of communal membership. He had been watching the gap, and the watching had convinced him that the gap was the source of the specific, quiet, pervasive suffering of people who do not know what they actually believe, who perform conviction they do not feel, who have organized their interior lives around the management of the space between the official position and the actual experience. He would not take the money. He would not maintain the performance. He had been given a choice between the belonging and the honesty, and he had chosen the honesty with the specific, quiet, entirely characteristic resolution of someone who knows that the belonging purchased by the performance is not the belonging worth having, who knows that the community you can only remain part of by pretending to be someone you are not, is not the community that can give you what community is actually for, who has understood already at 23 that the freedom of the honest interior is worth more than the security of the managed gap. The community received his refusal. They did what they had to do. They issued the cherem. There is one more thing that needs to be understood about the world before the break, about what Baruch was walking away from and what walking away from it cost. He was not walking away from nothing. The community was not simply the thing that had imprisoned him. It was also the thing that had made him. It had given him the language in which he first learned to think, the Hebrew of the prayers, the Aramaic of the Talmud, the Spanish and Portuguese of the household, the Latin of the school. It had given him the tradition that he was arguing with, which is a different thing from arguing in a vacuum. You cannot argue seriously with something you do not know. The depth of the argument Baruch was making was only possible because the tradition he was arguing with had given him the tools to make it. The Maimonides he was rejecting had taught him how to think philosophically about God. The scripture he was reading historically had given him the categories through which the historical reading was possible. He was not walking away from his formation. He was following his formation to its honest conclusions, and the community that cast him out had given him that formation, had given him the rabbi who taught him Talmud and the circle where the questioning was first possible, and the specific experience of being a member of a people who had survived by taking ideas seriously, who had understood in the bone that what you believe matters, that the ideas you hold determine the life you live, that the gap between belief and practice is not a trivial management problem, but the central fact of the interior life. He carried this understanding out of the community with him when the community's door closed. He would spend the next 20 years turning it into a philosophy, the philosophy that says what you believe matters because what you believe determines what you feel and what you feel determines how you act, that the emotions are not random weather, but the necessary effects of the ideas through which you encounter the world, that inadequate ideas produce inadequate emotions and adequate ideas produce the only freedom available, that the path from bondage to freedom is the path from the confused, partial, historically contingent ideas of the first kind of knowledge to the clear, adequate, causally complete ideas of the third, the path, in other words, from the gap to the understanding, from the performed belief to the genuine one, from the managed surface to the clear interior. He carried this understanding into the small rooms and the lens grinding and the 20 years of work that followed. He carried the community's gift, the seriousness about ideas, the willingness to let ideas matter, the refusal to treat belief as mere performance, and he turned it against the community's requirement. He used what they had given him to say, what they could not permit him to say. This is not ingratitude. This is the only way philosophy has ever worked. The tradition transmits the tools. The honest thinker uses the tools to go further than the tradition can follow. The community casts out the honest thinker. The honest thinker spends 20 years in a small room, turning what the community gave him into the argument that explains why the community did what it did. And the argument, if it is as good as this one, outlasts the community, the excommunication, the small rooms, the glass dust, the 44 years, the quiet Sunday morning in The Hague when the landlord came home from church and found the philosopher still. The argument is still here. The gap it was written to close is still here. The question it was written to answer is still the question. How much of what you believe do you actually believe? How much of what you feel have you ever actually understood? What is moving you right now that you have not yet looked at clearly? One must imagine Spinoza setting up his lenses, and finding in the setting up, in the patient grinding, in the daily return to the work, that is paying for the thinking and slowly destroying the body that houses it, something that the community that cast him out would have recognized if they had been able to receive it, as the practice of the tradition's deepest teaching that what matters is not what happens to you. It is what you understand about what happens to you, and the understanding, when it is genuine, is enough, more than enough. There is a sentence in the ethics that contains the whole of everything. It is not a dramatic sentence. It does not announce itself. It arrives in the middle of part 1, embedded in the geometric architecture of definitions and axioms and propositions and demonstrations that Spinoza builds his argument from, dressed in the dry Latin of 17th century philosophical discourse, presenting itself as the logical consequence of what has preceded it rather than as the most dangerous idea in Europe. The sentence is this: except God, no substance can be, nor can be conceived. Read it again. Let it settle. Except God, no substance can be. Everything that exists, every rock, every river, every human body, every human thought, every emotion, every galaxy, every grain of sand, every moment of consciousness, every act of love, and every act of cruelty is not a substance in its own right, is not a thing that exists independently in itself, through itself, is a modification of the one thing that exists in itself and through itself, is a mode, a way in which the single, infinite, eternal substance expresses itself in this particular form at this particular moment. And the single, infinite, eternal substance is God, or nature. Deus sive natura, God or nature, the same thing. Two names for the one thing that everything is a mode of. This is the idea that got him the most severe excommunication in the history of the Amsterdam community. This is the idea that got the ethics placed on the index of forbidden books. This is the idea that produced a century of denunciation so ferocious that Spinoza's name became, in the intellectual culture of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a synonym for atheism and immorality and the dissolution of all that civilization depended on. And it is the most honest idea in the history of philosophy. To understand what Spinoza is saying and why it matters for everything that follows, for the conatus and the emotions and the bondage and the freedom, you have to start where he starts, with the question that philosophy has always started with, and that most philosophy has answered badly. What is real? Not real in the ordinary sense of the things you can see and touch and measure. Real in the deeper sense, ultimately real. The thing that exists not because something else made it exist, but because existence is what it necessarily is. The thing that cannot not be. The thing that if you follow the chain of causes back far enough, you always arrive at because it is the ground beneath every other ground. The philosophical tradition before Spinoza had two main answers to this question. The religious answer said, God is real in this ultimate sense. God is the substance. Everything else is God's creation, made by God, dependent on God, existing because God wills it, and ceasing to exist when God withdraws the willing. God is the ground. The world is the thing standing on the ground. They are distinct. God is not the world, and the world is not God. The philosophical answer, the answer that Descartes had given, that was the dominant answer of the new philosophy, said, there are two substances, mind and matter, thought and extension, the mental world and the physical world. They are distinct kinds of thing, irreducible to each other, requiring different descriptions and different explanations. Spinoza looks at both answers and finds them inadequate. Not wrong exactly, inadequate, producing more problems than they solve, leaving questions unanswered that the honest philosophical investigation cannot leave unanswered. The religious answer leaves you with a God who created the world from nothing, who intervenes in the world's operations, who has preferences about human behavior, who can suspend the natural laws that constitute the world's regular operation whenever the divine will requires it. This God is, Spinoza argues, incoherent. If God is infinite and perfect and necessarily existing, then God cannot lack anything, cannot be moved by anything outside God, cannot change the world's operation without changing God's own nature. The God who gets angry and relents, who is pleased and displeased, who performs miracles and answers prayers, this God has the properties of a very large and very powerful human being, not the properties that the concept of an infinite perfect being actually requires. The Cartesian answer leaves you with the mind-body problem. If thought and extension are genuinely distinct substances, how do they interact? How does the decision to raise your arm produce the arm's rising? How does the physical event of the toe being stubbed produce the mental event of the pain? Descartes could not answer this. His solution that the interaction happened in the pineal gland was not an answer. It was a placeholder. It was the honest acknowledgement that his framework had produced a problem it could not solve. Spinoza solves both problems with a single move. There is only one substance, not two, not many, not the creator and the created. One. The infinite, eternal, necessarily existing one thing of which everything else is a mode. And this one substance has infinite attributes, infinite ways of being, infinite aspects under which it can be understood. Human beings, with their finite understanding, can grasp two of these attributes, thought and extension, the mental and the physical. But these are not two substances, they are two attributes of the one substance. Two ways of describing the same thing from different angles. This is why your decision to raise your arm and the arm's rising are not two events in two different realms that mysteriously interact. They are the same event described in two different registers, the same modification of the one substance apprehended under the attribute of thought and under the attribute of extension simultaneously. Not cause and effect, not interaction, identity. This is elegant. It is more than elegant. It is the kind of move that changes everything, that reorganizes the entire landscape of the questions, that makes problems that seemed intractable dissolve, because the framework that produced them has been replaced by one that does not. But it is also, and this is where the danger lives, the move that makes God into nature. If God is the one substance of which everything is a mode, then God is not separate from the world. God is not the creator looking at the creation from outside. God is the world. The world is what God is. Every rock and river and human body and human thought is God expressing itself necessarily in this particular form. This means that the God of the Bible, the God who creates the world from nothing, who speaks to Moses, who parts the Red Sea, who rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, who has preferences about what human beings eat and who they sleep with and how they worship. This God does not exist. Spinoza does not say this crudely. He says it with the geometric precision of someone who has derived the conclusion from first principles and who understands that the derivation is the argument. He says it by establishing what God must be: infinite, eternal, necessarily existing, having infinite attributes, not lacking anything, not moved by anything outside itself, and then showing that the biblical God is inconsistent with these requirements. The God who gets angry lacks something, the equanimity that perfection requires. The God who performs miracles changes the world's operation, but the world's operation is God's own nature, and changing it would require God to act against God's own nature, which is a contradiction. The miracle is impossible, not because God is indifferent or powerless, because miracles would require God to contradict God's own necessity, and necessity cannot contradict itself. The prayer that changes outcomes is impossible, not because God does not care, because the world's operation is the expression of God's nature, and God's nature cannot be other than it is. The outcome that would have occurred if you had not prayed is the expression of what God necessarily is. The outcome that would occur if the prayer were answered is also the expression of what God necessarily is. But these are different outcomes. God cannot necessarily be both. The prayer cannot change what is necessary. This is devastating for the theological tradition. It eliminates the personal God. It eliminates divine providence. It eliminates the religious consolation that says, suffering has a purpose, the divine plan is working itself out, the injustice you see is temporary and will be corrected. There is no divine plan. There is the necessary expression of the one infinite substance in every modification that occurs. The just suffer and the unjust flourish, and the universe shows no preference because the universe, God, has no preferences. Everything that happens, happens necessarily. Everything that exists expresses God's nature with the same fidelity. The stone and the saint, the act of love and the act of cruelty, all modes of the one substance, all equally the expression of what God is. This is what the community heard. This is why they were afraid. But wait, because what sounds like the most despairing possible account of the universe is, in Spinoza's hands, the beginning of something completely different. If everything is the necessary expression of the one infinite substance, then everything is intelligible. Everything has a reason. Everything follows from causes that can, in principle, be traced. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing is random in the deep sense of genuinely uncaused, genuinely unaccountable. The universe is not a chaos. It is not a collection of events that might have been otherwise, that occur by chance or by the whim of a divine personality who could have chosen differently. It is the necessary expression of what necessarily is. And this means that understanding is possible, not partial understanding, not the approximate understanding of a creature trying to get a rough map of a territory that is fundamentally mysterious. Genuine understanding, the understanding that grasps the necessity, that sees not just what happened but why it could not have happened otherwise, that traces the cause not just one step back, but all the way back to the one substance whose nature is the ultimate explanation of everything. This understanding is not available to human beings in its fullness. We are finite modes of an infinite substance. We grasp two of the infinite attributes, thought and extension, and we grasp them imperfectly, partially, through the confused and limited perspective of a creature embedded in the causal chain, rather than standing outside it. We cannot see the whole, but we can see more clearly or less clearly. We can understand more or understand less. We can trace causes further or stop tracing them sooner. We can hold adequate ideas, ideas that grasp the necessity, that see the cause, that understand the mechanism. Or we can hold inadequate ideas, the partial, confused, historically contingent ideas of the person who is simply moved by what they feel without understanding what is moving them. And this is where everything connects. The God or nature that Spinoza describes is not the God of consolation. It is the God of intelligibility. The universe is not on your side, but it is comprehensible. And comprehensibility, for Spinoza, is everything, because the path from bondage to freedom runs directly through it. The bondage is the inadequate idea. The freedom is the adequate one. And the adequate idea is the idea that grasps the necessity, that understands what it is encountering as the expression of what must be. Think about what this means for the emotions. The anger that arrives before you decide to be angry. The fear organized around a threat that no longer exists. The love that reorganizes everything without asking your permission. In the religious framework, these are problems to be managed. Deviations from the rational self-governance that the virtuous person is supposed to achieve. Failures of the will, evidence that the animal nature is not yet fully subordinated to the divine image in which you were made. In Spinoza's framework, they are modes of God. They are the one infinite substance expressing itself necessarily in the form of your specific emotional response to your specific encounter with a specific aspect of the world. They are not failures. They are not deviations. They are the expression of what you are, of the specific mode of the infinite substance that you are encountering. What it encounters with the necessity of what it is. The anger is not a failure. It is a necessary consequence of what you are meeting. What it is meeting. The fear is not a weakness. It is the expression of your nature under specific conditions that your nature finds threatening. The love is not an irrationality. It is the striving of your being, the conatus, the drive of every mode to persist and expand, recognizing in the beloved something that serves the striving. This is the beginning of the transformation that Spinoza is offering. Not the transformation that says, master your emotions, subordinate the animal to the rational, achieve the equanimity that virtue requires. The transformation that says, understand your emotions, see them as the necessary expressions of what you are in relation to what you're encountering. Trace the causes, find the adequate idea, because the emotion understood is different from the emotion merely felt. Not different in its content, the anger is still anger, the fear is still fear, different in its power over you. The anger you understand does not determine your behavior, in the same way that the anger you do not understand determines it. The fear you have traced to its cause and found adequate or inadequate is not the same fear that simply moves you because something has activated the pattern without your awareness. Deus sive natura, God or nature, the one infinite substance of which you are a mode. The universe that does not lie, that expresses what it is with the full necessity of what it is. That makes everything intelligible if you are willing to look clearly enough. This is not the universe that answers prayers. It is the universe that rewards understanding, and the reward is the only freedom Spinoza believes is real. There is a passage in the Theological Political Treatise, the book Spinoza published in 1670, the only major work he published under his own name during his lifetime, the book that was immediately condemned and banned, and that was read everywhere it was banned, where he says something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He is talking about why people believe in miracles, about the psychological function that the miracle serves, about what the human mind is doing when it reaches for the supernatural explanation. He says, men are especially prone to call something a miracle when they cannot understand its natural cause. Read that again. Not. People believe in miracles because they are stupid or superstitious or insufficiently educated, because they are human, because the human mind, confronted with something it cannot explain, reaches for the explanation that makes the unexplained feel explained, reaches for the divine intervention, the suspension of natural law, the personal God who has chosen this moment to act in this way for this person. The miracle is what the inadequate idea looks like when it encounters something it cannot trace. The miracle is the gap in understanding filled with God, and Spinoza is not condemning this. He is describing it, with the specific compassion of someone who understands that the inadequate idea is not a moral failure. It is where human understanding currently is. It is what happens when the mind has not yet found the natural cause, when the tracing has not gone far enough, when the adequate idea has not yet replaced the inadequate one. The cure for the miracle is not atheism. It is not the replacement of God with the void, the exchange of divine intervention for meaningless mechanism. The cure is the adequate idea, the understanding that traces the cause far enough to see the necessity, that finds in the natural explanation not the deflation of the sacred but its purest expression, that recognizes in the intelligibility of the universe, in the fact that everything that happens follows necessarily from the nature of the one infinite substance, something more genuinely divine than the miracle-working personal God who suspends his own laws to answer prayers. The most divine thing about the universe is that it is honest. It does not pretend, it does not perform. It is what it is with the full necessity of what it is, God or nature, the one thing, the thing that everything is a mode of, the thing that you are a mode of, and knowing this, genuinely knowing it, not as an intellectual position, but as the adequate idea that grasps the necessity, that sees yourself in your full causal context, that understands what is moving you, as the expression of what must be. This knowing is the beginning of the freedom that Spinoza spent his life arguing for, and demonstrating and dying slowly in service of. Not the freedom from causes. There is no freedom from causes. The freedom of understanding them, which is, when it is genuine, indistinguishable from love. He worked on the ethics for 20 years. He wrote it in geometric form, the form of Euclid's Elements, the form that was, in the 17th century, the gold standard of rigorous demonstration, definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, scholia, the notes where the geometric armour is briefly set aside and the human being behind the argument speaks more directly, with something closer to urgency, with something that is almost the quality of the man in the small room who has understood something and wants you to understand it too. He did not publish it in his lifetime. He knew what would happen if he did. He had published the Theological Political Treatise and had watched it be immediately condemned and read everywhere it was condemned, and had received enough of the denunciation to understand that the ethics which went further would receive more. He kept it in manuscript. He shared it with the small circle. He revised it over the years as the thinking deepened and the demonstrations became more precise and the implications of the central idea, the one substance, God or nature, the modes, the attributes, became more fully worked out. He sent it to his publisher in Amsterdam the week he died. He was 44 years old. The glass dust had done what the glass dust does. The Ethics was published posthumously. It was immediately banned. It was read everywhere it was banned. It changed every serious philosophical mind that encountered it. Leibniz read it and denied having read it. Hume encountered its implications in the development of his own empiricism. Kant built his critical philosophy in dialogue with it. The German Romantics, Goethe, Schelling, Novalis, found in Spinoza's one substance the philosophical ground for the sense of the world as a living whole that their art was trying to express. Einstein was asked in 1929 whether he believed in God. He said, "I believe in Spinoza's God." He meant, "I believe in the God that is the intelligible order of things, the God that is not personal, not intervening, not rewarding or punishing, the God that is the necessity that underlies everything, the God of the adequate idea, the God that is available to understanding. Deus sive natura, the most dangerous idea in 17th century Europe, the most honest idea in the history of philosophy, the idea that makes everything else possible." Stop for a moment. Not metaphorically, actually, stop. Put down whatever else you're holding in your attention right now. The next thing you need to do, the thing you're worried about, the low-level hum of the day's unfinished business, and notice what is happening in you right now, in this moment, before you have decided anything about it. There is something moving, not something you chose to set in motion, not something you decided to feel or think or want, something already running when you arrived at this moment. Something that was running before you opened your eyes this morning, and that has been running continuously since then, and that will keep running until it cannot run anymore. A striving, a pressure, a leaning towards something and away from something else. The specific, directionless urgency of a creature that is always, in every moment, oriented, always reaching, always in the posture of a self that is not yet complete, not yet arrived, not yet in possession of whatever would, if it could be found and kept, finally still the motion. You know this. You have always known this. It was there before you had a name for it, and it will be there after every name you give it has been exhausted. Baruch Spinoza gave it a name. He called it conatus, and what he said about it is the most important thing anyone has ever said about what you are. The word comes from the Latin. To strive, to endeavor, to tend toward. Conatus is the striving, the drive of everything to persist in its own being, to continue existing, to maintain and, if possible, to expand the expression of what it is. This is Spinoza's proposition from Part 3 of the Ethics, stated with the precision of a geometric theorem. Each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being. Each thing, not each person, not each conscious being. Each thing. The stone strives to remain a stone. The river strives to reach the sea. The plant strives toward the light. The animal strives to eat, to reproduce, to escape the thing that threatens it. The human being strives to continue existing and to increase the power of that existence, to become more fully what it is, to expand the range of what it can do and feel and understand and be. This striving is not a drive you have. It is not a property of you the way your height or your hair color is a property of you, something you possess while remaining distinct from it. It is what you are. The striving is the essence. The conatus is not in you. You are in the conatus. You are the striving temporarily organized into the form of a person. Feel the difference between those two statements. A thing that strives can stop striving, can put the striving down, can decide through an act of will to want less, to need less, to be still. This is the dream of the ascetic, the fantasy of the meditator, the promise of every tradition that says, the suffering comes from the wanting, so learn to want less, and the suffering will diminish. But if you are the striving, if the conatus is not something you have, but something you are, then there is no putting it down. There is no version of you that exists on the other side of the wanting. The wanting is not the obstacle to peace. It is the existence. It is what being alive means for the kind of thing you are. You cannot want less. You can understand the wanting better. This is the entire difference. Now here is what makes this more than philosophy. The conatus is not neutral. It is not a blind drive that pushes you equally in all directions without any qualitative difference between the pushings. It has a direction, a valence. It is always in every moment either succeeding or failing, either increasing your power to act, your capacity to be fully what you are, or being diminished by what it encounters. And this This increase or diminishment of the power to act is what the emotions are, not metaphorically, precisely. This is Spinoza's claim, and it is the most important claim in the ethics, and it is the one that most readers move past too quickly because it seems like it might be reductive, might be flattening the rich complexity of human emotional life into something too simple, too mechanical, too far from the actual texture of feeling. It is not reductive, it is illuminating. It is the adequate idea of the emotions, the idea that sees them clearly, that grasps the necessity in them, that shows you what they actually are rather than what the various stories you tell about them suggest they are. Joy, what Spinoza calls laetitia, is the emotion that accompanies an increase in the power to act. When something happens, when you encounter someone or something, when a situation arises or resolves and the effect on your conatus is expansive, when you become, through the encounter, more capable, more alive, more fully yourself, more able to do and think and feel and be, you experience joy, not necessarily the bright, uncomplicated happiness of someone who has just received good news, the specific quality of expansion of the organism becoming more of what it is. Sadness, tristitia, is the emotion that accompanies a decrease in the power to act. When the encounter diminishes you, contracts you, makes you less capable, less alive, less fully yourself, you experience sadness, not necessarily weeping or despair, the specific quality of contraction, of the organism becoming less of what it is, and desire, cupiditas, is the conatus itself as you're aware of it, the striving as it presents itself to consciousness. Not a specific wanting for a specific thing, but the fundamental orientation of a being that is always leaning, always reaching, always in the posture of the not yet arrived. Everything else, all the named emotions, all the specific textures and colours of the interior life that seem so varied and so individual, that reducing them to these three seems impossible, is a combination or a modification of these three. Love is joy accompanied by the idea of its cause. You feel expansive, and you know why. The beloved is the cause of the expansion. Hatred is sadness accompanied by the idea of its cause. Fear is a sadness not yet certain, the anticipation of a diminishment that has not yet arrived. Hope is a joy not yet certain, the anticipation of an expansion that has not yet occurred. Envy is sadness at another's joy, the conatus diminished by the evidence that someone else's conatus is flourishing. Gratitude is the desire to benefit someone who has benefited you, the conatus, having been expanded by an encounter, oriented toward returning the expansion, and so on, through the entire taxonomy of human emotional life. Every specific feeling traceable back to the fundamental dynamic of the conatus, encountering the world and being expanded or diminished by what it meets. Sit with this for a moment, with what it actually means for the emotion you're most familiar with, the one that arrives most reliably in your own life, the one you have the most complex relationship with. Take the anger, the specific anger that belongs to you, that arrives in the particular situations that produce it in you with the reliability of a law rather than the randomness of weather. What is it, in Spinoza's terms? It is the conatus being diminished. Something has happened. Someone has said something, a situation has produced something, an expectation has been violated, and the effect on your power to act is contractive. You have been made less capable, less free, less able to be fully what you are in this moment, and the anger is the conatus's response to this diminishment, the mobilization of the striving against the thing that has diminished it, the energy of the organism asserting itself against the constraint. This is not wrong. The anger is not a failure. It is information. It is the conatus accurately registering that something has decreased your power to act and mobilizing in response. But, and this is where the philosophy begins to do its actual work, the anger is only as accurate as the idea that accompanies it, because the anger is always directed at a cause, always organized around an idea of what produced the diminishment. And this idea may be adequate, may accurately identify the cause, may correctly trace the mechanism by which your power was decreased, or it may be inadequate, may misidentify the cause, may locate the diminishment in the wrong place, in the wrong person, in the wrong aspect of the situation. The person who was unkind to you this morning and activated your anger, is the anger about them, or is the anger about something they reminded you of? Something that installed this particular sensitivity in you long before this morning, something that has been organizing this pattern of response since long before you encountered this specific person. Is the cause of the anger what you think it is? Have you traced it far enough? Spinoza does not ask you to stop feeling the anger. He asks you to trace it, and the tracing changes it, not by eliminating it, by making it adequate, by replacing the inadequate idea, the idea that says this specific person is the cause of this specific pain, with the adequate idea that sees the full causal chain, that understands not just what produced the feeling, but why. What in your nature and your history makes this the response you have to this kind of encounter? What the diminishment is actually about? The anger understood is different from the anger merely felt. Not in its emotional quality. It is still anger, still the mobilization of the conatus against the diminishing thing, but in its power over you. The understood anger does not determine your behavior with the same compulsion as the anger that simply moves you. You are, in the understanding, the author of it, in a way that you are not the author of the passion that acts without your comprehension. Now here is where the lens grinding returns, not as a biographical detail, as the demonstration. Baruch Spinoza spent 20 years grinding lenses in small rooms in Dutch cities. He did this every day, with the patient skill of a craftsman who understood that the work had to be good, that the people who looked through his lenses needed to be able to see. He did this while the glass dust settled into his lungs, while the accumulation built year by year toward the outcome that everyone who ground lenses knew was coming. His conatus was being diminished daily by the work that sustained the thinking, the power to act, the power to breathe, to exist, to continue the philosophical project that was the fullest expression of what he was being reduced by the very activity that made the project possible. He knew this, he understood the cause, he traced it as clearly as any cause can be traced. The glass dust enters the lungs. The lungs lose capacity. The body that houses the thinking becomes less able to house it. This is the mechanism. This is what is happening. And he kept grinding, not from ignorance, not from the resigned helplessness of someone who has no alternative. He had alternatives. He had been offered professorships and patronage, and the financial security that would have made the lens grinding unnecessary. He declined them. He declined them because accepting them would have required confining his philosophizing within limits that were not his to set, would have required the managed gap, the performance of coherence, the distance between what he thought and what he was permitted to say, would have required, in short, the bondage. He chose the lens grinding over the bondage. He chose the diminishment of the body over the diminishment of the mind. His conatus, presented with the choice between the expansion of thinking and the survival of the body that housed the thinking, chose the expansion. This is amor intellectualis Dei in biographical form, before it is a philosophical concept, as the lived practice of a man who understood what was moving him and chose the motion anyway. The conatus of Baruch Spinoza was the thinking. The striving of his being toward its fullest expression was the philosophical understanding. The glass dust was the price. He paid it, not because he was indifferent to his own survival, because he understood what he was, understood that the conatus, his conatus, was not primarily oriented toward the continuation of the body, but toward the fullest expression of the mind that the body housed, that the life worth prolonging was the life of the understanding, that shortening the life in service of the understanding was not a diminishment of the conatus, but its most precise expression. He was not a thing that strove for self-preservation. He was the striving itself, expressing what it was with the full necessity of what it was. And the glass dust was not the tragedy. The glass dust was the proof. But let us not aestheticize this. Let us not make it into something more comfortable than it is. The conatus is not always heroic. It is not always the philosopher grinding his lenses with serene acceptance of the cost. It is also the person who cannot stop eating the thing that is harming them, the person who stays in the relationship that diminishes them because the leaving feels more diminishing still, the person who keeps reaching for the approval of someone who will never give it because the reaching is the only form the striving has learned to take in relation to that particular person. The conatus is what you are, and what you are includes the patterns that do not serve you, the drives that are organized around inadequate ideas of where the expansion lies, the strivings that are pursuing the wrong object, not wrong morally, wrong practically. Wrong in the sense that the thing being reached for does not actually increase the power to act, that it promises expansion and produces contraction, that the joy it offers is temporary and the sadness it leaves is structural. The person who drinks to feel better and feels worse, the person who performs the bravado that their conatus has learned to wear as protection and finds themselves more isolated with each performance, the person who works endlessly toward a success that, when it arrives, leaves the wanting unchanged because the wanting was never really about the success. All of these are the conatus in its inadequate form, the striving organized around inadequate ideas of where the expansion actually lies. This is the bondage that Spinoza is diagnosing, not the bondage of external constraint, the bondage of a striving that does not understand itself, that is reaching toward the wrong things because the ideas that organize the reaching are partial, confused, historically determined, because the child who learned that love means this specific configuration of experience, or that safety means this specific arrangement of circumstances, is still organizing the adults striving around the child's inadequate map. The conatus is moving. It is always moving. The question is whether what it is moving toward actually serves it, and you cannot answer that question without the adequate idea, without looking clearly at what is actually increasing your power to act and what is actually diminishing it, without tracing the causes far enough to see not just what the striving is reaching for, but why, what the history is that installed this particular direction, whether the direction still serves the being that is doing the striving. There is a question that follows from everything Spinoza says about the conatus and that he addresses directly and that most readers find the hardest to receive. If the conatus is what you are, if the striving is the essence, if everything you feel and do and want is the expression of the one infinite substance through the specific mode that you are, then in what sense are you responsible for any of it? If the anger that arrives before you decide to be angry is the necessary expression of your nature meeting its encounter, if the love that reorganizes everything is the conatus recognizing in the beloved something that serves it, if the fear is the striving, anticipating diminishment, if all of this is necessary, if it all follows from causes that go all the way back to the one infinite substance expressing itself necessarily, then what is left of responsibility? What is left of the sense that you could have done otherwise, that you are the author of your life rather than its vehicle? Spinoza's answer is not comfortable, but it is honest. You could not have done otherwise, not in the sense of genuine alternative possibility, of the universe genuinely branching at the moment of your choice. Given what you were and what you encountered and what the history was that formed what you were, the outcome was necessary. It could not have been other than it was, but the understanding changes what the necessity produces, not by introducing a gap in the causal chain, not by creating a moment of genuine uncaused choice in which you stand outside the necessity and select freely from alternatives, but by making the cause a different cause. The person who understands what is moving them is moved differently from the person who does not understand it. The adequate idea is itself a cause. The understanding is itself a modification of the conatus that produces different effects than the ignorance. You cannot step outside causation. You can change the cause, not by willpower, by understanding this is the entire argument. The movement from bondage to freedom is not the movement from caused to uncaused, from necessity to choice, from the determined to the free, in the sense of the unconstrained. It is the movement from the inadequate idea to the adequate one, from the partial, confused, historically contingent understanding of what is moving you to the clear, complete, causally grounded understanding of it. And this movement, from the inadequate idea to the adequate one, is itself the conatus expressing its highest possibility, the striving toward its fullest expression, the being becoming most fully what it is, which is, for a human being, a being capable of understanding, the striving toward understanding, toward the adequate idea, toward the intellectual love of God, toward the freedom that Spinoza found in the small room, with the glass dust settling in his lungs and the ethics taking shape on the desk, the freedom that is not the absence of causes, the freedom of knowing them. You are in it right now, not as a philosophical proposition, as the actual condition of your actual interior in this actual moment. The bondage Spinoza is describing is not a historical curiosity or a psychological category that applies to other people. The less self-aware, the less educated, the less philosophically sophisticated. It is the default condition of consciousness. It is where every human being spends most of their time. It is where you are spending most of yours. The question is not whether you are in bondage. The question is whether you know it. Because the bondage does not feel like bondage from the inside. This is the crucial thing. The thing that makes it bondage rather than merely constraint. A constraint you can see is not bondage in Spinoza's sense. You can work around a visible constraint. You can decide how to respond to it. You can trace its edges and find its limits and navigate accordingly. The bondage is the constraint you cannot see because you have mistaken it for yourself, because the force that is moving you has become so continuous, so familiar, so woven into the texture of what you call your character and your preferences and your way of being in the world that you cannot distinguish between the force and the self that is supposedly choosing. The anger that arrives before you decide to be angry. You experience this as your anger, as the authentic response of a person who has been treated badly, who is responding appropriately to what has happened. You are not wrong that something has happened. You are not wrong that the anger is real, but you may be wrong about what the anger is, about whether it is tracking the actual cause of the diminishment, or whether it has attached itself to the nearest available target with the efficiency of a force that does not wait for accurate identification before it moves. The fear that is present when you wake up, already there before the day has given you a specific reason for it, attaching itself as the day provides occasions to the available material, the thing you have to do today, the conversation you're not looking forward to, the outcome you cannot control. You experience this as reasonable concern about real things, and some of it is. But the fear was there before the things. The things are partly the occasion and partly the content that the pre-existing fear has reached for in order to justify itself, in order to have a specific object. Because the fear is more manageable when it is about something specific, rather than floating as the ambient dread of a creature whose conatus is anticipating diminishment without knowing why. The wanting that does not stop. The specific restlessness of a creature that arrives at the thing it was reaching for and finds, almost immediately, that the reaching has resumed, that the satisfaction has begun to hollow out before it has fully arrived, that the gap between where you are and where you need to be has reopened somewhere new in a different configuration, requiring a different reaching. You experience this as the reasonable forward motion of an ambitious person who has not yet found what they are looking for. You may be right, but you may also be the person who has organized the wanting around an inadequate idea of where the expansion actually lies, who has been reaching toward the same wrong destination in different forms for years, without asking why the arrival never produces what the reaching promised. This is the bondage, not dramatic, not the obvious compulsion of the person whose suffering is visible. The ordinary, daily, entirely unremarkable condition of a consciousness that is moved by forces it does not understand and calls the movement its choices. Spinoza distinguishes between two kinds of emotion with a precision that changes everything once you've understood it. The passive emotion, the passio, is the emotion in which you are simply moved, in which the external thing acts on you and produces a response in you, and the response happens with the full force of the cause, and you experience it as your feeling, without having any genuine understanding of the causal chain that produced it. The word passive here does not mean weak or subdued, it means what it means in grammar. You are the object of the action rather than its subject. The thing is happening to you. You're not doing it. The cause is acting through you without your comprehension. The active emotion, the actio, is not a different category of feeling. It is not a calmer or more controlled version of the feeling. It is the same feeling understood, the same anger, but traced to its adequate cause, the same fear, but seen clearly, its origins understood, its object accurately identified, its proportionality to the actual situation assessed, the same love, but held with the adequate idea of what the love is and where it comes from, and what it is actually organized around. The difference between the passive and active emotion is the difference between being moved and understanding what is moving you. And this difference, which sounds like it might be small, might be merely intellectual, might be the difference between two versions of the same experience with a philosophical commentary added to one of them, is in practice the difference between bondage and freedom. Let us be specific. Let us take the emotion that Spinoza considers most enslaving and follow it closely enough to feel the mechanism rather than merely understand it. Hope. Hope seems like a virtue. In most frameworks, religious, therapeutic, cultural hope is what you're supposed to have. The person who has hope is resilient, forward-looking, capable of sustaining effort in the face of uncertainty. The person who has lost hope is depressed, defeated, in need of intervention. Spinoza looks at hope and sees something different. Hope, he says, is a joy not yet certain. It is the anticipation of an expansion that has not yet arrived. The conatus oriented toward a future increase in its power to act, registering this orientation as the specific emotional quality of hopefulness. The warm, forward-leaning feeling of the person who believes that things will be better. This sounds fine. This sounds good. What is wrong with expecting things to be better? Nothing. If the expectation is grounded in adequate ideas, if the hope is the reasonable anticipation of an outcome that the evidence supports, that the causes make likely, that the mechanism you understand makes probable, everything. If the hope is the passive emotion of a consciousness that has organized itself around a future that serves the emotional need rather than the accurate assessment, that has produced the feeling of expansion by imagining an outcome rather than by encountering the actual present, that has traded the lived reality of the current moment, which may be uncomfortable, which may be requiring something from you, which may be asking you to look at what is actually here for the pleasant anticipation of a future that is not yet real and may never be, because the person organized around hope is not here. They are in the future. They are in the configuration of circumstances that will, when it arrives, finally justify their full presence in their own life. They are waiting, and while they wait the present, the only time in which anything actually exists, the only time in which the conatus is actually operating, the only time in which the adequate idea can be formed and the freedom pursued is passing. Hope is the bondage that feels like optimism. Its twin is fear. Fear is sadness not yet certain, the anticipation of a diminishment that has not yet arrived, the conatus oriented away from a future decrease in its power to act, registering this orientation as the specific emotional quality of fearfulness. Fear and hope, Spinoza says, are always found together. You cannot have one without the other. Where there is hope, where the conatus is reaching toward an uncertain future expansion, there is also fear of the failure of the hope, the anxiety about whether the anticipated good will arrive. Where there is fear, where the conatus is anticipating a future diminishment, there is also hope that it will not arrive, that circumstances will change, that the feared outcome will be avoided. Hope and fear are the twin engines of absence. They both take you out of the present. They both orient the consciousness toward a future that does not yet exist. They both substitute the imagined for the actual, the anticipated for the encountered, the not yet for the now. And the person organized around hope and fear, which is most people most of the time, is living in a permanent anteroom to their own life, always preparing for something that is not yet here, always responding to something that has not yet happened, always oriented toward the future in a way that empties the present of its actual content. Spinoza is not telling you to stop planning, not telling you that the future is irrelevant or that anticipation is inherently confused. He is pointing at the specific quality of the passive emotion of hope and fear, the quality that makes them bondage rather than merely anticipation, the quality of organizing the entire interior life around outcomes that are uncertain, of living inside the uncertainty rather than inside the present moment where the actual causes are operating and the actual power to act is available. The adequate idea of the future is the understanding of the causes that will produce it, not the hope or the fear, the tracing. The person who understands the causal mechanism is not hoping or fearing. They are acting. They are doing what the causes make possible. They are in the present with the adequate idea of what is happening and why, engaging with the actual situation rather than with the imagined version of how it might turn out. There is a specific form of the bondage that Spinoza identifies as the most pervasive and the most destructive, the one that is most characteristic of the human condition, the one that his entire practical philosophy is organized around curing. It is the bondage of the inadequate idea of the self. You have an image of yourself, a sense of what you are, your character, your capacities, your limitations, your characteristic ways of being in the world. This image is not simply invented. It is built from experience, from the accumulated evidence of what has worked and what has not worked, from the reactions of others, from the patterns that have repeated often enough to seem fixed, from the specific history that formed the specific person you have become. But the image is partial. It is organized around what has been noticed rather than what is there, shaped by what the people who mattered most to you in the formation of the image were capable of seeing and responding to, constrained by what the roles you inhabit, child, student, professional, partner, have needed you to be and what they have had no room for. The image is the conatus as it has been understood so far, not the conatus as it actually is, and the gap between the image and the actuality is where most of the suffering lives. The person whose image of themselves excludes the anger, who has decided, for reasons installed long before they were capable of deciding anything, that they are not an angry person, that anger is not available to them, that the appropriate response to the situations that produce anger is management. This person is moved by the anger anyway. It finds expression in the passive forms available to it, in the passive aggression that does not announce itself as anger, in the depression that is the anger turned inward, in the specific, pervasive exhaustion of a person who is spending enormous energy suppressing a force that is not going away because it has been declared unavailable. The person whose image of themselves excludes the vulnerability, who has constructed, for reasons that made excellent sense in the context that formed them, an identity organized around capability and competence, and the performance of not needing this person is moved by the vulnerability anyway. It finds expression in the relationships that fail because the genuine contact they require is not available, in the loneliness that is the price of the performance, in the specific quality of distance that the person who cannot show their need maintains from everyone who might meet it. The bondage is the gap between the image and the reality, between the conatus as it has been permitted to express itself and the conatus as it actually is, between the self that has been constructed in relation to the specific requirements of the specific history and the self that exists underneath the construction. Spinoza is not telling you that the construction is false. It is real. It is genuinely you, the person who formed in these specific conditions, through these specific experiences, in response to these specific requirements. But it is not all of you. It is the portion of the conatus that has found expression. The rest has been put elsewhere, into the shadow in Jung's language, into the bondage in Spinoza's, into the territory of the self that is not yet understood. And the not understood portion does not stop operating. It operates in the passive forms available to it, in the symptoms and the patterns and the recurring situations and the emotions that arrive before you decide to feel them, organized around the inadequate idea of what you are and what the world is doing to you and what you need to do in response. He writes in part 4 of the Ethics, the part titled On Human Bondage, or the powers of the emotions, a sentence that I want you to read slowly. The powerlessness of man to govern and restrain the affects I call bondage. For a man who is subject to affects is not his own master, but is mastered by fortune, in whose power he so far lies that he is often compelled, although he sees the better for himself, to follow the worse. He sees the better for himself, to follow the worse. You know this. You have lived this. The moment when you could see clearly what the better response was, the kinder word, the wiser choice, the action aligned with what you actually value, and found yourself doing the other thing anyway, moving toward the worse, even while seeing the better, acting from the passive emotion, even while the part of you that can see clearly watched from behind the glass. Spinoza is not judging this. He is describing it with the precision of someone who has observed it in himself and in the human world around him, and has decided that the description is the diagnosis, and the diagnosis is the beginning of the cure. The powerlessness is real, the bondage is real, but it is not permanent. It is not the final word on what you are. It is the condition that the inadequate idea produces, and the inadequate idea can be replaced by the adequate one, and the adequate idea produces a different condition, not immediately, not completely, not in the clean, dramatic before and after way that the culture of transformation promises, in the specific, partial, ongoing, never finished way that genuine understanding always works, in the way that seeing something clearly, even once, even partially, even in the moment after it has already moved you, changes your relationship to the next instance of it. That the anger you understood yesterday is not quite the same anger today, that the fear you traced last week does not have quite the same grip next week, that the conatus, having been given the adequate idea of what it is encountering, is not quite as compelled by the passive emotion the next time it arises. This is not the liberation of the achieved freedom. It is the practice of the liberation that is always in process, always incomplete, always the next step rather than the destination. But the next step is real. The partial seeing is real. The moment when the passive emotion is understood, even slightly better than it was understood before, this moment is the freedom, partial and temporary and requiring renewal, that Spinoza believes is the only freedom actually available. And he believes with the specific, quiet, entirely grounded optimism of a man who found this freedom in the small room with the glass dust and the lens grinding and the 20 years of unglamorous work, that it is enough, more than enough, if you will, do the looking. There is a morning that most people have had, and almost no one examines carefully enough. You wake up, the day assembles itself around you, the obligations, the relationships, the unfinished business of yesterday, carrying forward into today with the persistence of things that do not resolve themselves overnight. And somewhere in the assembling, before the day has fully constituted its demands, there is a moment of unusual clarity, a moment in which something you have been tangled in, a relationship dynamic, a recurring pattern, a fear that has been organizing your behavior for longer than you can easily trace, is suddenly, briefly visible. Not just present, but visible. You can see it. You can see what it is and where it comes from, and why it keeps recurring, and what you have been doing in response to it, and why what you have been doing has not been working. The moment lasts a few seconds, maybe a minute, then the day arrives with its requirements, and the clarity recedes, and you're back inside the pattern, moved by it the way you have always been moved by it, with the additional frustration of knowing that you saw it clearly a few minutes ago and cannot quite recover the seeing. This is the difference between the first and second kind of knowledge, not the dramatic difference between ignorance and enlightenment, the ordinary, daily, entirely available difference between the confused partial understanding that moves you without your comprehension, and the clearer understanding that, when it is present, changes your relationship to what is moving you. The difference that is not a permanent achievement, but a capacity, not a destination, but a practice. Not something you arrive at once and keep, but something you find and lose and find again and gradually, over years, over the sustained effort of a person who has decided that understanding matters, find more reliably and lose less completely. Spinoza calls this the movement from imagination to reason to intuition, and it is the most practically important thing in the ethics. The first kind of knowledge Spinoza calls imagination, imaginatio. Not imagination in the creative sense, not the capacity to invent things that do not exist. Imagination in the epistemological sense, the confused, partial, affect-laden knowledge that comes from the accumulated experience of a creature embedded in the world, from sense perception, and from what others have told you, and from the patterns your history has installed, and from the specific, contingent, entirely personal archive of encounters that has formed your sense of what the world is, and how it works, and what things mean. This is how most people know most things most of the time. I know that this person is untrustworthy because they remind me of someone who was untrustworthy. I know that this situation is dangerous because situations like this one have been dangerous before. I know that I'm not good at this. I know that this is what love feels like because this is what the experiences I have called love have felt like. This knowledge is real. It is not worthless. It keeps you alive. It allows you to navigate the world with the rough efficiency of a creature that has learned from experience. It connects you to the people around you through the shared archive of culturally transmitted understanding, the language and the norms and the collective sense of what things mean that make social life possible. But it is partial. It is organized around what has been encountered rather than around what is actually there. It is shaped by the specific, accidental, entirely contingent history of your encounters rather than by the actual nature of the things you're encountering. And it produces necessarily, as the effect of what it is, the passive emotions, the responses organized around the history rather than the present, the anger that is responding to what this situation reminds you of rather than to what this situation is, the fear that is anticipating what situations like this one have produced rather than accurately assessing what this situation will produce, the love that is organized around the template, the history installed, rather than around the actual person in front of you. The imagination is the source of the bondage, not because imagination is bad, because imagination left unexamined is the only knowledge available, because without the second kind of knowledge to correct and supplement it, the imagination is the entire interior world, and the entire interior world organized around partial, historically contingent, affect-laden impressions is the interior world that is simply moved by what it encounters, with no genuine understanding of what is moving it. The second kind of knowledge Spinoza calls reason, ratio, and what he means by reason is more specific and more useful than the general capacity for logical thought that the word usually suggests. Reason, in Spinoza's sense, operates through what he calls the common notions, notiones, communes, the ideas that are common to all things, the features of reality that hold across every particular instance, that are not the product of any specific historical encounter, but are genuinely, necessarily, universally true of everything that exists. The most fundamental common notion is something like this: everything that exists is the expression of causes. Nothing is uncaused, nothing happens by accident in the deep sense of being genuinely without reason. Every effect follows from causes that follow from prior causes that follow from prior causes, all the way back to the one infinite substance whose nature is the ultimate ground of everything. When you genuinely understand this, not as a philosophical proposition you have accepted, but as the actual applicable truth of your own experience, your relationship to the emotions changes, because you stop expecting them to be otherwise. You stop experiencing the anger as a failure, or the fear as a weakness, or the recurring pattern as evidence of something permanently wrong with you. You start asking what produced this. What is the cause of this specific emotion in this specific moment? What in your nature and your history is meeting what in this situation to produce this response? The asking is the second kind of knowledge beginning to operate. The willingness to trace rather than simply feel, to look for the cause rather than accepting the emotion as a brute fact about yourself, to find the mechanism rather than identifying with the response. This sounds straightforward. It is not. The first kind of knowledge does not give up its territory without resistance. The imagination, the historically formed, affect-laden, partial understanding, has been organizing the interior for as long as you can remember. It is familiar. It is the texture of what you have called your character and your responses and your way of being in the world. The adequate idea that would replace it is not immediately available, It has to be worked toward, arrived at, through the sustained, patient, unglamorous practice of asking the question that imagination does not ask. What is actually causing this? But the asking, sustained over time, produces something, not immediately. Not in the dramatic moment of the insight that changes everything, in the slow accumulation of more adequate ideas that gradually, partially, incompletely, but really, replaces the confused partial understanding with something clearer. That makes the passive emotion somewhat more active. That makes the caused response somewhat more understood. That narrows, by degrees, the gap between what is moving you and what you know is moving you. He works through this in the Ethics with examples that are so specific and so carefully chosen that you can feel him reaching for the thing that will make the abstract argument land as lived experience rather than philosophical proposition. Take the example of the sun. When you look at the sun, it appears to be about 200 feet away. This is the first kind of knowledge. The sense, perception, unexamined, delivering what it delivers, the sun as a relatively small, relatively near object, a disk of light at a manageable distance from the observer. But you know, because you have learned the astronomy, that the sun is approximately 93 million miles from where you're standing. This is the second kind of knowledge. The common notion, the mathematical and physical understanding of the solar system, correcting the first kind, replacing the confused impression with the accurate measurement. And now notice something. When you look at the sun after learning this, it still appears to be about 200 feet away. The first kind of knowledge does not disappear because the second kind has arrived. The impression persists. The sense perception delivers the same confused information it has always delivered. But your relationship to the impression is different. You do not believe it. You see the appearance and you know it is an appearance. You hold the first kind of knowledge and the second kind simultaneously, not confused about which is which, not deceived by the appearance into thinking it is the reality. This is what the second kind of knowledge does to the passive emotions. The anger does not disappear because you understand its cause. The fear does not vanish because you have traced it to the inadequate idea that is organizing it. The love does not dissolve because you have recognized the projection it contains. The emotions persist. They are causes, and causes do not stop operating because you have named them, but your relationship to them is different. You see them and you know what they are. You feel the anger and you understand what is producing the anger. And the understanding means you are not simply inside the anger the way you are inside it when it moves you without comprehension. You have, in Spinoza's language, made the passive emotion somewhat more active. You have moved from being the object of the action to being, at least partially, its subject. Not fully, never fully. The causes go all the way back to the one infinite substance, and no finite mind can trace them all the way to the ground. But further, clearly enough that the emotion has a different quality, clearly enough that the behavior it produces is different, clearly enough that the bondage is, in this specific instance, and to this specific degree, loosened. The third kind of knowledge, Spinoza calls intuition scientia intuitiva, and here the argument reaches its most difficult and most important territory. Intuition is not what the word usually means, not the gut feeling, not the immediate impression, not the unreflective response that the first kind of knowledge produces. Intuition, in Spinoza's precise sense, is the highest form of understanding, the understanding that grasps the thing, not just in its immediate context, not just in its causal relationship to the things immediately around it, but in its full relationship to everything in its place, in the order of the one infinite substance expressing itself necessarily through every modification. The person who has arrived at the third kind of knowledge of something does not just know what it is and why it is. They see it as a specific, necessary expression of the one infinite substance, as the thing it could not fail to be given what everything is. They see it with the specific quality of understanding that Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, the joy that accompanies the adequate idea of what is causing it, the love that arises from seeing clearly. This sounds mystical. It is not mystical. It is the specific, earned, laboriously achieved understanding that comes from following the causes far enough, from asking why until the asking reaches the ground, from looking at the thing, the emotion, the relationship, the situation, the self, with enough sustained honest attention that the confusions of the first kind of knowledge have been replaced, gradually and incompletely, but really by something more adequate to the thing as it actually is. Spinoza reaches this level of understanding in the Ethics when he writes about the emotions themselves. He looks at the anger, the fear, the hope, the love, the hatred, the envy, the gratitude, looks at all of them with the sustained, honest attention of a man who has been thinking about them for 20 years, in small rooms with the glass dust settling in his lungs, and he sees them clearly, sees them as the necessary expressions of modes of the one infinite substance, encountering each other with the full necessity of what they each are, sees them not as moral failures or spiritual achievements or evidence of character, but as causes and effects, as the conatus meeting the world and registering the meeting as joy or sadness or desire, and in the seeing, in the adequate idea of what the emotions actually are, he finds the specific quality of peace that his biography demonstrates, the serenity that is not the absence of feeling but the presence of understanding, the freedom that is not the absence of causes but the knowledge of them. There is something that needs to be said about the practice of moving from imagination to reason to intuition that most accounts of Spinoza omit because it does not fit comfortably into either the rationalist tradition that claims him or the therapeutic tradition that has found his ideas useful. It is slow. Spinoza does not offer a technique. He does not offer a method you can apply in 10 steps or 20 minutes of daily practice, or the right sequence of therapeutic interventions. He offers an orientation, a direction, the commitment to asking the question that imagination does not ask what is actually causing this, and sustaining the asking over the time it takes for the adequate idea to arrive and replace the inadequate one. This time is not a weekend. It is not a course of therapy, though therapy can be part of it. It is the time of a life seriously devoted to understanding. The time of a person who has decided, with whatever degree of genuine commitment they can bring to the decision, that the adequate idea matters more than the comfort of the inadequate one, that seeing clearly is worth the discomfort of what is seen, that the bondage is worse than the work of loosening it, even when the work is slow and the loosening is partial, and the bondage keeps reasserting itself in new forms, as the understanding reaches new territory. Spinoza knows this because he lived it. 20 years in the small rooms, 20 years of the patient, sustained, entirely unglamorous practice of following the argument wherever it led, 20 years of arriving at more adequate ideas, slowly, incompletely, with the glass dust settling in his lungs and the lens grinding, paying for the thinking and the community that formed him on the other side of the door that closed in 1656. He is not offering you enlightenment. He is not promising transformation. He is describing a practice, and the practice is the movement from imagination to reason to intuition, and the movement is available, and the movement is worth making, and the movement takes the time it takes. There is no shortcut. There is the asking, there is the sustained attention, there is the willingness to replace the comfortable inadequate idea with the uncomfortable adequate one when the adequate one arrives. And there is, when the adequate idea genuinely arrives, when the third kind of knowledge is present, however briefly, however partially, however requiring renewal, the next time the same question arises in a new form, the specific quality of the intellectual love of God that is the subject of the next section, the joy that accompanies the adequate idea of what is causing it, which is, when it is genuine, indistinguishable from freedom. The highest human good is not happiness. This needs to be said directly and held without immediately softening it, because the instinct to soften it is itself a form of the bondage. The instinct that says, surely he cannot mean that happiness does not matter. Surely the good life is one in which suffering is reduced and pleasure increased, and the conditions of flourishing are met. Surely the point of the philosophy is to feel better. It is not because feeling better is wrong, not because the reduction of suffering is unimportant, or the increase of genuine joy is a trivial goal, But because happiness in the ordinary sense, the warm, effectively positive, comfortable state that the self-help industry is organized around producing, is the wrong target, is the target that when you organize your life around hitting it, consistently produces its opposite, consistently produces the specific, pervasive, low-grade suffering of the person who has made their peace of mind dependent on circumstances behaving in the ways that peace of mind requires, and has found, again and again, that circumstances will not behave. The highest human good, Spinoza says, is understanding. Specifically, it is what he calls amor intellectualis Dei, the intellectual love of God. And if you have followed the argument to here, through the conatus and the passive emotions and the three kinds of knowledge, you already know that this phrase does not mean what it sounds like. It does not mean the devotional love of a personal deity. It does not mean the mystical union with the divine that the religious traditions describe. It does not mean anything that requires a God separate from the world, a transcendent being who receives and returns the love of the creature who approaches him, Deus sive natura, God or nature. The same thing, the one infinite substance of which everything is a mode. Amor intellectualis Dei is the love that arises from seeing clearly, from the adequate idea, from the understanding of what is causing what you're experiencing, traced far enough that the necessity becomes visible, that the thing is seen not as the arbitrary imposition of circumstances, but as the expression of what must be. It is, in Spinoza's precise definition, joy accompanied by the adequate idea of its cause, not joy in the absence of difficulty, not joy because circumstances have arranged themselves favourably, joy that arises from the understanding of what is happening, whatever is happening, the specific, real, entirely unglamorous peace of the person who has looked at what their life is, at all of it, the difficulty and the loss and the recurring patterns and the glass dust settling in the lungs, and has understood it clearly enough that the understanding produces something that functions like love, not sentimental love, not the love that depends on the beloved being other than they are, the love that arises from seeing what is there. Spinoza is 70 years old in the small room in The Hague, sitting at his desk in the final months of his life. He is not 70. He is 44. He has been dying for years from the glass dust, and he has perhaps a few weeks left, and he knows this or suspects it with the accuracy of a man who has been paying close attention to what is happening in his body with the same patient honesty that he has brought to every other object of his investigation. He is grinding fewer lenses now. The lungs do not permit the sustained effort that the grinding requires. He sits at the desk more than he stands at the grinding wheel. He corresponds, he receives visitors, he works on the political treatise that he will not finish. He has sent the ethics to his publisher. It will be published after his death. He is, by every external measure, a man whose life has not gone well. He was cast out of his community at 23. He spent the next 20 years in rented rooms in cities that tolerated him within limits. He declined every offer of patronage or position that would have required compromising what he thought. He lived simply, plainly, even austerely, not as the performance of philosophical virtue, but because the simplicity was what the thinking required and the thinking was what he was. He watched the book he considered his masterwork circulate in manuscript for years, because publishing it would have produced a storm of condemnation that would have made the work impossible to read seriously. He was right. It was published, and immediately condemned, and read everywhere it was condemned, and changed every serious philosophical mind that encountered it, and he did not live to see any of this. He died in a small room on a Sunday morning in February 1677. His landlord found him. The family had been at church, and the people who knew him, the small circle of friends and correspondents who had access to the man rather than just the work, described him with a consistency that is striking. They described him as serene, not serene in the performance of serenity, not the managed calm of the person who has learned to display equanimity for the benefit of others, serene in the specific way of someone who has understood what their life is and is at peace with the understanding, who has looked at the causes, the excommunication, the rented rooms, the glass dust, the dying young, the refusals, the work that will not be recognized in his lifetime, and has found in the looking, in the genuine adequate idea of what is happening and why, something that functions like acceptance without being resignation. The difference between resignation and acceptance is the difference between the sadness of defeat and the joy of understanding. Resignation is the passive emotion, the conatus that wanted something different and gave up wanting it, still organized around the wish for the other thing, still carrying the sadness of the not having, the shape of the absence where the desired outcome should have been. Acceptance is the active understanding, the conatus that has looked at what is happening with the adequate idea and found in the looking not the elimination of the difficulty but its comprehension, that understands the causes clearly enough that the resistance to what is, the specific suffering of fighting against the necessity rather than understanding it, is replaced by something else, not something comfortable, not the warm satisfaction of someone who has what they wanted, something more austere and more real than that, the joy of seeing clearly. Amor intellectualis Dei does not arrive as an achievement. It does not come at the end of a process of self-improvement as the reward for having done the work correctly. It is not the destination that the practice of the three kinds of knowledge delivers you to. Finally, when you have been at it long enough, it arrives, when it arrives, as a quality of attention, as the specific texture of an encounter with something, with a person, with a situation, with an aspect of yourself, in which the adequate idea is genuinely present, in which you are seeing what is there rather than what your history has taught you to expect to find there, in which the conatus is understanding its encounter rather than simply being moved by it. This can happen anywhere. In the consulting room, when the patient says something and you understand, not intellectually, in the body with the specific quality of recognition that belongs to the adequate idea, what is actually happening in them. In the relationship, when the other person's behavior that has been activating you for months or years is suddenly, briefly seen clearly, not as malice or failure or the evidence of incompatibility, but as the necessary expression of what they are given, what has formed them. In your own interior, in the rare moments when the pattern that has been running without your comprehension is briefly visible, and you see not just that it is there, but what it is, and where it comes from, and why it has been operating in this way. These moments are the intellectual love of God, not in the metaphysical sense of the creature approaching the Creator, in the precise sense that Spinoza intends, joy, accompanied by the adequate idea of what is causing it, the expansion of the conatus that comes from understanding, the specific quality of warmth that genuine seeing produces in the person who has been looking at something partially and confusedly for a long time and has finally, in this moment, seen it whole. The warmth is not separate from the understanding, it is the understanding. It is what the adequate idea feels like from the inside when the adequate idea is genuinely present rather than merely claimed. There is a practical question that everyone who encounters Spinoza's ethics eventually asks, and the honest answer to it matters more than any of the theoretical framework. Does it work? Does the movement from imagination to reason to intuition actually produce the freedom that Spinoza describes? Does tracing the causes of the passive emotions actually change your relationship to them? Does the adequate idea genuinely loosen the bondage? Or does the bondage reassert itself regardless of how clearly you have understood it? And the understanding is just the philosophical commentary on a suffering that continues unchanged. The honest answer is partially, incompletely, requiring renewal, never arriving at the clean, permanent liberation that the phrase intellectual love of God might suggest to someone reading it without the careful preparation of the preceding parts of the ethics. But partially and incompletely and requiring renewal are not nothing. The anger you understood yesterday is not quite the same anger today. This is the smallest possible claim, but it is real. The person who has once traced their anger to its adequate cause, who has once found the adequate idea of what is producing this response in this situation, does not respond to the next instance of it with exactly the same compulsion. Something has shifted. Something has been introduced into the space between the impulse and the response that was not there before. Not a gap of freedom in the metaphysical sense of genuine alternative possibility, a gap of understanding, a moment in which the cause is recognized rather than simply operative, in which the passive emotion is partially active, in which the person is, to that degree, and in that moment, less moved and more understanding. And this accumulates, not dramatically, not in the way that progress is supposed to look from the outside, in the way that genuine understanding always accumulates, slowly, partially, with setbacks and returns to the confusion, with the bondage reasserting itself in new forms, as the understanding reaches new territory, with the occasional moment of genuine clarity that shows you where you are and how far there is still to go, and is, in the showing itself, the thing. Spinoza lived this. The serenity the people around him described was not the serenity of someone who had solved the problem of existence. It was the serenity of someone who had understood it well enough that the fighting against it had stopped, who had arrived through the 20 years in the small rooms with the glass dust and the ethics taking shape on the desk, at a relationship to his own life in which the adequate idea was present more reliably than the inadequate one, in which the intellectual love of God, the joy of seeing clearly, was the texture of the daily experience rather than the occasional gift of the rare moment of insight. Not always, not completely, but reliably enough, genuinely enough. He was asked, toward the end of his life, by a correspondent who had been following his work for years and who wanted to understand what the practice produced, what it felt like from the inside, what the intellectual love of God was as an experience rather than as a philosophical concept. We do not have his exact reply. We have the correspondence, which is extensive and often extraordinary in its honesty. But this specific exchange may not have survived or may never have taken place in exactly this form. But we have the ethics, and the ethics is the answer. Not in the arguments, in the quality of the arguments, in the specific texture of the writing. Dry, precise, relentlessly logical on the surface, and underneath the surface something else, something warm, the warmth of a man who has looked at the full difficulty of the human condition, the bondage, the passive emotions, the inadequate ideas, the suffering that follows from what we are and what we encounter, and has found in the looking, in the genuine, sustained, adequate looking, not despair, but something closer to tenderness. Tenderness toward the people in bondage, toward the community that cast him out, toward the political authorities who banned his books, toward the human beings who are moved by forces they do not understand and call the movement their choices, and suffer the consequences, and cannot see clearly enough to find their way to the understanding that would loosen the bondage. He looks at all of it with the intellectual love of God, with the adequate idea, with the joy that arises from seeing clearly, not because the seeing makes it easier, because the seeing makes it comprehensible, and comprehensibility, for Spinoza, is the highest thing available to a human being, the closest approach to the divine that a finite mode of the infinite substance can achieve. The lens grinder in the small room, the glass dust settling in his lungs, the ethics on the desk, the serenity that the people who knew him described, and that was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of understanding. This is what Spinoza found. This is what he is offering. Not happiness, not the absence of causes, not the freedom from the forces that move you, the understanding that sees the forces clearly, the adequate idea of what is happening and why, the joy that this understanding produces, which is, when it is genuine, indistinguishable from love. He died on a Sunday morning in February 1677. His landlord, Hendrik van der Spijk, came home from church and found him. The room was small, the furniture was plain, the lens-grinding tools were there, and the books and the correspondence and the manuscripts that had been sent to Amsterdam the week before, the ethics among them. He was 44 years old. The glass dust had done what the glass dust does. What he left behind was almost nothing by the ordinary measures. No family, no institutional position, no accumulated wealth, no house of his own, no community. The community had closed its door 21 years before, and the door had not reopened. No reputation, not in the sense of the recognized philosopher whose work the educated world had absorbed and argued with and built on. The reputation would come, but he would not be alive to receive it. What he left was the work, the ethics, the theological political treatise, the correspondence, the unfinished political treatise, the short treatises on the intellect and on God and on man and his well-being that had circulated in the small circle during his lifetime, and that were gathered now in the collected works his publisher would produce. The work is still here, not because it won, not because the philosophical tradition recognized it immediately and incorporated it into the official story of how Western thought developed. The ethics was placed on the index of forbidden books. Spinoza's name was used, for decades after his death, as a synonym for everything threatening and dissolving and dangerous in modern thought. The great minds who learned from him, and they were among the greatest minds of the next 2 centuries, learned from him quietly, often without acknowledgement, often while publicly distancing themselves from the position they were privately incorporating, because the idea was too dangerous to claim openly, because the idea was too honest to set aside.